The most humiliating revelation in American infrastructure policy wasn't discovered by transportation officials or construction experts. It was discovered by local mayors who realized that fixing America's roads, bridges, and public works had become impossible without Canadian engineering expertise and construction capacity that could disappear if diplomatic relationships collapsed. I've been analyzing infrastructure policy and public works capacity for decades, and I can tell you that the revelation of American infrastructure dependence on Canadian construction expertise represents one of the most fundamental challenges to American governmental competence since the interstate highway system was completed. Not because the dependence was suddenly created, but because it was finally acknowledged by local officials who had built their careers on the assumption that basic infrastructure maintenance was a solved problem rather than an ongoing institutional failure. The public story, as it's been presented in infrastructure policy debates and transportation funding discussions, painted a picture of routine maintenance challenges and funding shortfalls. Roads need repair, bridges require updates, and public works projects face the usual bureaucratic delays. Standard government language that usually masks the uncomfortable reality that American infrastructure competence has eroded so completely that basic public works now require foreign assistance. But the reality behind that narrative was far more troubling and far more embarrassing for American governmental capacity. American infrastructure maintenance had become dependent on Canadian engineering expertise, specialized construction equipment, and technical capabilities in ways that made routine public works projects vulnerable to disruptions in cross-border professional relationships. Road construction, bridge repair, and municipal infrastructure development had all become integrated across borders in ways that made American infrastructure independence largely mythological. The psychological moment when this dependence became undeniable came during a series of infrastructure crisis meetings where local officials were forced to confront the arithmetic of American construction capacity. When you map the actual sources of engineering expertise, specialized equipment, and technical capability required for infrastructure projects, the picture that emerges is of a public works system that couldn't function without Canadian professional support. Let me walk you through exactly how this dependence developed, because the mechanics reveal important truths about how modern infrastructure systems actually function. Infrastructure independence isn't just about having construction workers or concrete suppliers. It's about maintaining the full spectrum of engineering expertise, specialized equipment, and technical capabilities required for complex public works. American infrastructure capacity had been optimized for short-term cost savings rather than long-term competence, and that optimization had created dependencies that infrastructure independence rhetoric never acknowledged. The bridge engineering sector provides the most striking example of this structural dependence. Modern bridge construction and maintenance requires highly specialized engineering expertise, advanced materials, and sophisticated construction techniques that are concentrated in relatively few firms globally. American infrastructure agencies had become dependent on Canadian engineering companies not as a matter of convenience, but as a matter of necessity. Alternative expertise existed in theory, but accessing it would require training investments and capability development that could take decades to complete. When political tensions threatened the reliability of this integrated engineering support, American infrastructure officials discovered that substituting Canadian expertise with domestic alternatives wasn't just expensive. In many cases, it was technically impossible without massive educational and industrial investments that would fundamentally reshape American engineering economics. Entire classes of infrastructure projects literally couldn't be completed without Canadian engineering support, regardless of how much domestic construction capacity existed on paper. The specialized construction equipment sector revealed similar dependencies that contradicted public assumptions about American infrastructure self-sufficiency. Canadian construction companies had developed capabilities and equipment that had become essential to American infrastructure projects because American firms had abandoned certain specializations as economically unviable. Equipment for cold weather construction, specialized bridge work, and complex municipal projects was increasingly sourced from Canadian firms that maintained capabilities American companies had outsourced or eliminated. This integration worked effectively when it was treated as a partnership between complementary construction industries. It became a strategic vulnerability when political rhetoric began treating infrastructure relationships in terms of national competition rather than professional cooperation. The moment American officials started talking about infrastructure independence in ways that ignored Canadian dependencies, they highlighted vulnerabilities they had preferred to minimize. Canadian officials understood this dynamic perfectly and positioned themselves accordingly. Instead of threatening to withdraw infrastructure support, which would have been economically damaging for Canada as well as America, they simply began highlighting the importance of stable, cooperative professional relationships for maintaining infrastructure functionality. The message was clear without being confrontational. Infrastructure maintenance requires technical cooperation, and technical cooperation requires mutual professional respect. What made this Canadian approach particularly effective was how it combined practical necessity with subtle leverage. American infrastructure officials couldn't argue with the technical realities of engineering expertise and equipment dependencies, and American local leaders couldn't ignore the implications of infrastructure failure for public safety and economic functionality. When infrastructure security becomes a public safety issue, policy priorities shift rapidly toward accommodation rather than confrontation. The broader implications of this infrastructure dependence extended far beyond construction issues into fundamental questions about American governmental competence and institutional capacity. When your neighbor controls critical elements of your infrastructure maintenance capacity, that neighbor gains influence over your domestic policy implementation, whether they choose to exercise that influence explicitly or not. Infrastructure functionality is governmental legitimacy, and governmental legitimacy depends on relationships that can be disrupted by institutional incompetence. This leverage became visible in how American officials began approaching infrastructure policy decisions that could affect Canadian interests. Public works projects, transportation regulations, and construction standards were increasingly evaluated not just for their direct engineering merits, but for their potential impact on Canadian cooperation in infrastructure maintenance matters. When infrastructure functionality depends on maintaining stable professional relationships, those relationships become policy priorities that constrain governmental flexibility. The economic implications reached deep into American communities that had built their development plans around the assumption of infrastructure competence. Local governments, businesses, and residents that had invested in areas dependent on functional infrastructure discovered that their investments couldn't be protected independently of Canadian technical cooperation. The gap between political messaging about infrastructure investment and infrastructure reality created planning uncertainty that affected everything from economic development to property values. From Canada's perspective, this recognition of American dependence created opportunities that Canadian infrastructure professionals had never actively pursued but couldn't ignore once they became apparent. When your technical expertise becomes essential to your neighbor's governmental functionality, you gain influence over your neighbor's policy implementation, whether you want that influence or not. Canadian infrastructure policy began reflecting this new understanding of Canada's strategic importance in North American public works systems. Canadian infrastructure investment started focusing on capabilities that complemented rather than competed with American capacity, but in ways that made Canadian cooperation more essential rather than less. Engineering expertise expanded, specialized equipment manufacturing improved, and technical capability development accelerated in areas where American systems had gaps that Canadian systems could fill. What's particularly striking about this transformation is how it revealed the gap between American political culture and American infrastructure reality. Political leaders could talk about infrastructure independence and governmental competence, but local officials had to deal with the practical requirements of maintaining roads and bridges. When rhetoric and reality diverge so dramatically, infrastructure policy becomes disconnected from infrastructure needs. The international implications of American infrastructure dependence on Canada extended far beyond bilateral relationships into global infrastructure politics. When other countries observed that American infrastructure competence was largely mythological, it affected how they approached their own infrastructure relationships with America. If America couldn't maintain infrastructure independence from its friendliest neighbor, how credible were American infrastructure partnerships for countries that needed technical assistance guarantees? This credibility gap became visible in how international infrastructure partnerships were structured. Countries that had traditionally looked to America for infrastructure technology and engineering expertise began developing alternative arrangements that didn't depend on American capacity to deliver infrastructure competence that America hadn't maintained for itself. When the infrastructure provider can't provide for itself independently, the provision becomes conditional rather than reliable. The technological dimension of American infrastructure dependence on Canada is equally significant but less visible to the general public. Modern infrastructure depends not just on construction workers and concrete, but on advanced engineering software, specialized construction techniques, and sophisticated project management capabilities. Canada's strength in cold weather engineering, complex project management, and infrastructure technology made American infrastructure functionality dependent on Canadian technical capabilities in ways that infrastructure independence advocates never honestly addressed. When political relationships affect access to these technical resources, infrastructure independence becomes even more mythological. You can't maintain independent infrastructure systems with dependent technical capacity. And American infrastructure technical capacity was deeply dependent on Canadian expertise, equipment, and capabilities in ways that infrastructure independence rhetoric never acknowledged. The most sobering aspect of this entire revelation is how it demonstrates that infrastructure competence requires not just domestic construction capacity, but domestic institutional wisdom that prioritizes long-term infrastructure maintenance over short-term political advantage. Infrastructure systems are built over decades and depend on technical continuity that extends beyond electoral cycles. When political culture undermines that continuity, it undermines infrastructure functionality, regardless of domestic construction resources. For American infrastructure planners, the recognition of infrastructure dependence on Canada forced a fundamental recalibration of what infrastructure competence actually means in practice. True infrastructure independence would require massive educational investments, technical capability development, and institutional restructuring that American infrastructure economics had proven unable to support independently. The alternative was accepting dependence and managing it through stable professional relationships rather than denying it through infrastructure mythology. The infrastructure stranglehold reveals more than a construction policy failure. It reveals the consequences of building political identity around myths rather than realities. When infrastructure independence becomes a political slogan rather than a technical objective, infrastructure policy becomes disconnected from the institutional requirements that make competence possible. And when that disconnection becomes apparent, the political mythology collapses in ways that reshape infrastructure relationships across an entire continent. As this reality continues to sink in for American infrastructure policymakers, what becomes clear is that North American infrastructure relationships have fundamentally shifted from American competence to Canadian dependence. The country that spent decades assuming its engineering heritage made infrastructure functionality automatic has discovered that its infrastructure functionality has become conditional on maintaining cooperative relationships with its northern neighbor. And once that shift in infrastructure leverage is acknowledged, it can never be completely reversed, regardless of how much political rhetoric tries to wish away the fundamental technical realities that created it.